The Dominion of New England, rather than being a new idea, was a descendant, and at least partially caused, by a much earlier colonial scheme, one that in many ways predates the so-called Pilgrims themselves in 1620. If you listen to our episode on the Popham Colony in 1607, you would know that the English claim to the east coast of North America was broken up into two overlapping sections and given to two competing companies. A Virginia Company of Plymouth and a Virginia Company of London. The Virginia Company of London, of course, would become quite famous and eventually find some success in the settlement of Jamestown, a story you know well. I won't have to repeat that. But the Virginia Company of Plymouth, which we've covered so extensively in this season, is so misunderstood that many people just assume the second company was just part of the first. Not quite. Now, as the Virginia Company of London set up Jamestown, shortly thereafter, the Virginia Company of Plymouth set up their colony, now known to us as the Popham Colony, in modern-day Maine, being named after Sir John Popham, who actually died fairly early on in the process of making this colony. And the real organizing force and energies behind the Popham Colony back in merry old England was a man by the name of Sir Ferdinando Gorges. The Popham Colony, of course, fell apart as the leaders on the ground in the New World found more opportunities back home. And then as Jamestown slowly grew down south, and then with the cultivation of tobacco, exploded, the northern claim of the Virginia Company of Plymouth, with nothing but a small amount of seasonal fishing camps every year, was becoming moribund. And in fact, the Virginia Company of London, at least for the good fishing waters, began to encroach upon that northern claim. Moving right into the 16 teens, it would be none other than John Smith of Jamestown fame who would create a map of this northern claim held by the Virginia Company of Plymouth. And on it, instead of calling it Northern Virginia or the northern part of Virginia or Norumbega, he called the land New England. Yes, it was John Smith who created the idea of New England. And on that map, he even labeled native settlements with English names. The Wampanoag settlement of Patuxet, he renamed Plymouth, as Sir Ferdinando Gorges, a major owner in the Virginia Company of Plymouth, was commander of the fort at Plymouth. It was in his honor. And so before the so-called Pilgrims even show up, we actually have Plymouth on a map in a place called New England. All this was done under the direction and funding of Sir Ferdinando Gorges, a hardline royalist and Anglican. And so in 1619 into 1620, when a group of dissenters from the Netherlands, who originally left England, settled within the claim of the Virginia Company of Plymouth, now called the Council for New England, Gorges and others were somewhat hesitant, but they were actually happy to have Englishmen on the ground to stake out the claim against the French, more distantly the Spanish, but more imminently, their own fellow Englishmen to the south, part of that other company. And they sanctioned the birth of the Plymouth Colony. And this is when it really starts to feed into our main story, because they did not give them the right to govern themselves. They gave them the right to settle the land and satisfy the natives there for that land. Two very different things. And I've said this before, but it bears repeating. I can buy a house. I can't then make that property a breakaway republic and refuse to pay New York state taxes. I mean, I'm fully capable of doing so, but you'll know if that happens because these podcasts will have a lot of extra reverb because I'll be recording from within a prison cell. And so Plymouth, with their Mayflower Compact, carve out their own government. And not soon afterwards, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, well within his right to do, sends his own son over there to govern over them and the fishing camps to the north, and many of the new planned settlements following hot on the heels of Plymouth. His son was titled the Governor General of New England, one unified colony. You can listen to the full episode on that, but obviously it doesn't work out. But we have that title, Governor General of New England. Keep that in mind. Moving into the 1630s, now with the Massachusetts Bay Company settling the land a little to the north of Plymouth, they transferred their corporate board from England to the New World and turned that board into a general court and turned that company into a colony, something they were not actually authorized to do, either in the charter they received from the Council for New England or the second charter they received over the council's head from the king himself. Moving right along, by 1635, Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who had been preoccupied by threats of war with Spain, things more important than these faraway lands he had never been to, had spent a few years not being very active in the council. It was infiltrated by very powerful Puritans. These are likely the men who gave the Massachusetts Bay Company their council charter in the first place. And when Ferdinando's attention turned back to the situation in New England, he saw that it very quickly became a land full of religious dissidents who were not adherents to the Church of England, and with the growing division in England proper, these settlers were likely falling in line with the building alliance against the king himself. Well, Gorges had just had enough. This was not what he planned for his New England. And so, around the year 1635, he becomes active again in his own council, and he petitions the king for a quo warrento, very similar to a warrant, for the Massachusetts Bay Company's charter. And a quo warrento is basically a demand to see the paperwork by which a government or government official derives their power. This would be Gorges's first step in rescinding the legal existence of the Massachusetts Bay Colony altogether. He also took on the title he once gave to his own son and became the Governor General of New England. And he planned a force of regulars. Some estimates go as high as 1,400 individuals who were to leave England and help Ferdinando install proper order in New England, which would mean wiping away the Plymouth Colony and the Massachusetts Colony as it was at the time, and making it anew. But for various reasons, these plans are scuttled. And while Massachusetts began making preparations for Gorges's rumored invasion, yes, Massachusetts was not worried about the French or the Wampanoag or the Spanish. They were worried about the English, but it was all for naught. Within Gorges's small sphere of influence, the plans fell apart, but in a larger view, England was tilting towards a civil war. And just like before, when matters in England present themselves, Ferdinando Gorges and many people in England simply drop any attention they pay to New England or anywhere else in the New World. If you're listening and you're an American, you tend to think that we're a pretty big deal, and we've been a big deal for quite a while, and having a colony is kind of cool and important. Not so much in 1635. For an English investor, a New World colony in 1635, especially outside of the Sugar Islands, or places on the mainland where you can make a cash crop like Virginia and tobacco, it would be equivalent to buying a cryptocurrency today. And not Bitcoin. It's speculative and doesn't present very much value now, but you're relying on future value. Likewise, as England descended into a civil war, the Puritans of New England got a little reprieve. And from the 1630s into the 40s, when things really start to heat up and the Civil War begins in earnest, the population of New England booms, both from the Puritan exodus, but also from natural increase, because we see whole communities and families moving over to the New World. So as England descends into madness, the New England only solidifies its new order, at times wholly independent from the mother country. Now, the Puritans believed that all these near misses, all these prophecies of doom that seemed to be so imminent, when they were thwarted at the last minute, that was an act of God. God showing his elect people his favor. They started to develop notions of destiny, of being a special people, being given an elevated status. They felt protected by God. And from 1635, when that warrant was issued, they did their best to stall and simply ignore it. They did so successfully until the King of England was fighting for his own throne, all the way through to when he loses his own head. And the Puritans must have felt like this was fate, because the decades just keep wearing on. Our story pushes all the way through until the 1660s, when New Englanders received the news that the English monarchy had been restored. King Charles's son becomes Charles II, and Charles's younger brother, at the time titled the Duke of York, receives a large swath of land that the Dutch once called New Netherland. The English take it over, and it becomes the king's brother's proprietary colony. Now, some people would think this would be a great thing for New England. Now you're surrounded by other English colonies. The Puritans didn't see it as much in that light. What they saw was a large colony, which on paper was supposed to go from the Delaware River straight to the Connecticut River, so within the boundaries of the Connecticut colony, and portions of it into modern-day Maine, owned by a member of the royal family, and curtailing their westward expansion. not as people. You could move to the New York colony, but as believers, as people who wanted a mild form of theocracy as a government, which they could not have in the New York colony. And for New York's part, this colony would be run more like an oligarchy or even a dictatorship, as it will lack an assembly, at least at the colony-wide level, and ruled by a governor selected by the Duke of York himself. One of these governors was Edmund Andros, who arrived in late 1674 to receive back the New York colony after it had been retaken by the Dutch. And the population, outside of Long Island anyway, basically handed over the colony to the Dutch, who only occupied the fort on Manhattan Island. Andros was in no mood to create a General Assembly. He did not feel the Magna Carta applied outside of England when it came to representation and taxation. And over the years of his rule, he tried time and again to absorb the Connecticut colony, but even more so, West New Jersey. And almost successfully, he tried to take over East New Jersey, occupying it for a time. He imprisoned Philip Carteret, the governor of East New Jersey, after kidnapping him from his house. He imprisoned John Fenwick, who had his own colony, Fenwick's Colony, in and around modern-day Salem, New Jersey, delegitimizing the other English governors around him in order to embolden the Duke's colony. And for the sake of his own wallet, the budget of his own government, and compensating his boss, the Duke, he tried to enforce customs collections on Manhattan Island, but also in these other colonies, which he perceived as being part of New York. Furthermore, in the years 1675 into 76, the New England colonies, in Plymouth especially, through their interactions with the Poconokeets and the larger Wampanoag world, find themselves in something called King Philip's War, which per capita is perhaps the deadliest war in colonial history. I don't even know what would be second place. These small New England colonies, from all the reports going back to England, some written by Andros himself, appeared intolerant, incompetent, disorganized, and although the end of the war would be accomplished by New Englanders and their native allies from New England, what officials in England were hearing was about how in the winter of 1675 into 76, Edmund Andros, governor of New York, convinced the Iroquois, who were being wooed by King Philip himself, to join this pan-native alliance against the English, that they should instead drive King Philip out of his winter encampment within the New York colony before they could receive guns and ammunition from natives allied with the French up in New France along the St. Lawrence. And the Mohawk did so, and spent the spring raiding those tribes hostile to the English in New England, pressuring them to give up or to switch alliances. In England, Andros and the Mohawk were the real heroes of King Philip's War. As that war died down in the year 1677, Andros and the Iroquois deepened the chain relationship between the two groups, which started with the Dutch, and they created what was called the Silver Covenant Chain of 1677. Andros and his New York colony now became the link between the powerful Iroquois and the other English colonies. Not only that, but these two parties then forged relationships with native groups out into what we would now call Pennsylvania and all the way down to Delaware, extending all the way up into Maine, rivaling the native diplomacy of the French to the north. Never before had the English had such an ambitious and competent, confrontational, and far-reaching governor. But in 1680, the party's over for Edmund Andros, as rumors of internal corruption, as well as his abuses towards the New Jersey governments and Connecticut, necessitated that he be recalled. And now the Puritans of New England and the Quakers and others who lived in the New Jersey colonies, they breathed a collective sigh of relief. And it seemed like once again, in the face of imminent danger and takeover, they had been delivered from a great menace. But there was a quieter threat at work, less powerful, but with deep roots and hatred for the Puritans of New England. There was a man, a trained lawyer, by the name of Edward Randolph. And in the years 1675 into 76, while New England is reeling from King Philip's War, Randolph is sent to the New World, partially as an investigator for the Lords of Trade, the new body created in England for monitoring and at least partially governing faraway colonies, intent on making them profitable and beneficial to the home country. He is also sent over to press the legal claims of the Gorges family and his one-time partner, the Mason family, which had controlled New Hampshire. Both families had long since given up their right to govern but they still felt they legally owned the undeveloped lands of these colonies. The Gorges family, especially in what is today Maine, which Massachusetts came to assume control over. And so, again, we're in the 1670s. The last time we heard from Gorges was the 1630s. He died during the Civil War. We're now 4 decades removed from the opening chapter of this episode. And here comes Edward Randolph with this 3-part mission, and there's no questioning whose side he's on. He's a cousin of the Mason family. And in fact, the Lords of Trade are making these inquiries on behalf of the Gorges and Mason families. And what Randolph returns to report is that much of New England, and Massachusetts specifically, is operating as its own independent nation, practicing free trade with other nations, including nations in Europe, in complete non-compliance with the new Navigation Acts. And over the years, as Randolph comes up in the world and eventually becomes a customs agent in Massachusetts, a job that came with many death threats, he would send back information that would shock the Lords of Trade. Massachusetts was minting its own coins. Massachusetts created a government from a company, and that government was controlled by a small group of Puritan elite, meaning the extension of suffrage in New England was far more restrictive than suffrage in Old England. He would pass along reports from prominent businessmen, people who owned seagoing merchant operations, on how this growing business class in New England lacked political rights. His summation of King Philip's War only reinforced Edmund Andros' account that these grassroots New England colonies were bumbling and mismanaged in nearly every way, sometimes intentionally. And the Lords of Trade developed the opinion from King Philip's War, but also the Dutch takeover in 1673 into 74, that little colonies like East and West New Jersey, even a lonely New York colony, really just focused around the Hudson River and Long Island, and the small New England colonies were simply too small to defend themselves appropriately. And in neither example were the French involved to any major extent. And so first, we want to enforce these navigation acts. Secondly, we want these English colonies to be secure from attack and takeover. And ultimately, how they planned to do this was to unite everything above the southern colonies into one or perhaps 2 mega colonies, where a local militia on one end would be compelled to help defend a town and their local militia on the other end. At the top, they could be governed by one single governor. Costs would be lower, defense would be greater, regulations, especially concerning transatlantic trade, would be enforced. There didn't seem to be a downside, except that there were still a lot of details to put into a plan like this, and it would be very difficult to design a colony on one side of the Atlantic and then try to see it through on the other side. And so in the decade after 1675, all the way until 1685, the Lords of Trade sought subtle ways to turn New England slowly toward that vision. And their number one target, of course, was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was a giant at the time. Don't think about the state of Massachusetts today. Think about Massachusetts, think about Maine, and on and off again, think about New Hampshire. Combined, now remember, you have to take the southeastern bit off for the Plymouth Colony, but Massachusetts, and all those areas I just spoke on, was in a confederation with the Plymouth Colony and the Connecticut Colony. If you could start pulling the strings on Massachusetts to make it your puppet, it would be your most effective tool in your arsenal. And so the Lords of Trade demanded that Massachusetts get rid of voting restrictions that varied at times, but either kept voting exclusive to church members or extended some voting rights in what was known as the Halfway Covenant to people who weren't church members but were approved of by the church. That had to go. What they wanted was for suffrage to extend to all landholding men. Yes, you heard me right, and this is why I love doing this podcast. We have a colony haggling with England, and it is England that wants to further democratize the colony against the wishes of the leaders of the colony. It's not the typical narrative you hear when discussing the period. The Lords of Trade also wanted to install a royal governor over Massachusetts to help ensure that these voting rights are respected, that the Puritan oligarchy is checked in some regard, and that those navigation acts are being followed. And they also demanded that the Massachusetts Mint be shut down because they had received no permission to mint their own coins. That's something an independent country might do, or a colony if they're specifically enabled to do so, which Massachusetts had not been. At this point, Edward Randolph is the customs agent in Boston. Often, when he attempted to do his job and he pressed for a case to try a defendant for violating the Navigation Acts, the juries in Boston were very favorable to these merchants on trial, and they would be acquitted. And then these merchants would personally sue Edward Randolph. Furthermore, Randolph would report that there were ships that would receive the governor's personal permission to come and go, and feel as if they were not answerable to him, circumventing his power altogether. These complaints, which sound mild, would strike a chord in England because the guilds there often complained about New Englanders importing goods directly from continental Europe in defiance of the Navigation Acts, which would have supported industry in England. Massachusetts, for instance, is supposed to receive all of its imports from the mother country, and all of its exports should be returning to the mother country. A designed trade imbalance where cheap raw materials would only have one nation to sell to and only one nation to buy from. This is a period where the English world is tilting from being a large, diffuse scattering of the English population to being a defined and functional system, perhaps not imperial in nature, as we would see in the 19th century, but colonial in nature. England is the head of the octopus, and the colonies are the legs. Meanwhile, people in New England, they took the view of the English realm somewhat akin to the modern-day notion of the Commonwealth, where you have the United Kingdom, and you have a place like Canada or New Zealand or Australia, who are separate nations, but they share a monarch who is limited by past agreements between the monarch and the people. Now, I'm not saying people in Massachusetts would have said they were their own nation, but as Edward Randolph observed, they acted like it. And leading right into the American Revolution, they certainly didn't believe that the governmental structures of England, and at the time of the American Revolution, the United Kingdom, outside of the king, and specifically I'm referencing Parliament, in their view in 1670 or 1776, we share a king, you have your legislative body, I have mine. But Massachusetts would not have it for long. In 1681, Edward Randolph, who had been much abused by the people of Massachusetts, let's face it, building on that earlier plan, suggests that the Massachusetts government be completely overhauled, with a temporary governor, and knowing this would take some time, until then, a temporary president should be selected, and that president should have a council, and that should be the colony-wide government. Not coincidentally, on October 21st, 1681, the Lords of Trade pull out that 1635 Quo Warranto, which likely many in Massachusetts forgot, and they demanded that Massachusetts send agents to England, or the Quo Warranto would be served. The likely result would be that Massachusetts would have no legal government whatsoever, nor any chance to have say in what the new government would be. Ferdinando Gorges, long dead, gets his revenge. Massachusetts fell back on their policy to stall and wait and hope that God would intervene. But 1681 turned into 82, turned into 83, and they had to send agents. But the General Court of Massachusetts specifically did not give these agents the power to accept a new charter. Another subtle yet more desperate delaying tactic. Once these agents arrive in England, they see through the ruse. They issue the Quo Warranto, and they nullify the Massachusetts Bay Colony government in 1684. Now, already the Lords of Trade had in mind who would be the Governor General of New England in this new proposed super colony. Their number one draft pick was Colonel Percy Kirk, or Kirk. I wonder if he's related to the same Kirk family that took over New France a generation before this time. They had him in mind to take over Massachusetts, Plymouth, New Hampshire, and Maine, as well as an area called the King's Colony, the King's County, Narragansett Country, a mostly fictional entity that the Rhode Island colony pushed for to protect the Narragansett tribe from New Englanders, other than themselves, who had very different relations with their neighbors. Events happen quickly now, because King Charles II dies, which throws the dice up into the air. There are threats of rebellion against his brother, the new king, James II. The colonel rushes to defend James II. The colonel and the Lords of Trade no longer consider a distant governorship the most important duty for this man. And the job fell to none other than the man who had proven that he was committed to protecting the territorial integrity of the Duke of York, now James II, the man who had seemingly mastered Native American relations, from the edge of Maine down to the Delaware River and over to the hinterlands of what's now western PA, and north of there to the Great Lakes, the man who had ruled New York without an assembly, the man who was no friend of the Puritans, Sir Edmund Andros, as the Governor General of the Dominion of New England. And if we were not talking about an English entity, but perhaps a colonial possession of France or an Iberian power, Andros would be vested with the types of powers fitting for a viceroy. And in fact, the Dominion of New England would have no constitution. Andros's commission was the Constitution. The man and the government were one. Andros was to be paid £1,200 a year, and very quickly the Lords of Trade and the king expected that the taxes and customs collected by the Andros administration would pay for itself, and then maybe even begin returning revenue back to England in some fashion, at least most certainly by ensuring all trade went to and came from the mother country. This revenue could be determined by Andros, the nature and amounts. He would have a council under him, but they only existed in an advisory role towards himself, and their powers were only given to them by delegation from Andros, much like a presidential cabinet today. Taxation was his complete domain. So would be all things military. In addition to being the Governor General, he was the Captain General of all militia and regulars, which there will be some regulars sent over from England, from the St. Croix River, St. Croix River, at the tippy top of Maine, all the way to the Hudson River. He was the commander-in-chief. This arrangement appealed to many of the English settlers on the very frontier of the English realm, bordering the French realm, of course. We'll often see in colonial history that one strength the French had, despite always being outnumbered as a whole, was that New France wasn't always fighting the whole, but collections of individual English colonies who choose to participate in colonial wars, or sometimes just a single colony. The Dominion, as a super-colony, would compel a militia from Rhode Island to come to the defense of a frontier town in New Hampshire, and could do so very quickly, without each individual small colony's general court bickering and arguing about how to respond, when to muster, how many men to send, who would be in charge. All of that's already done. Understanding that the types of Englishmen who relocated to the New World weren't given to Anglicanism, the Church of England actually was not made the official church of the Dominion of New England. There was no state church, but the Church of England was given special considerations. In other words, over time, Anglicans would be given out favor. But wisely, the Lords of Trade knew they couldn't apply a state church right from the get-go. Now, the Lords of Trade also wanted there to be an elected assembly, as there had been in much of New England, and in New York starting in 1683, and in the Jersey colonies. Colonists were used to having their voices heard in a single or bicameral legislative body mirroring the House of Commons and to some degree the House of Lords, which make up Parliament in England. But James II tells the Lords of Trade to remove that part of Andros's commission. Now Andros was under no obligation to create an assembly, and even the Lords of Trade thought that was a bad idea, and they told the king that. And even the Attorney General of England came to the opinion that depriving Englishmen of representation in this manner would be a violation of the Magna Carta. Nevertheless, King James II, whose father had wars with his own parliament, denied the people who lived within the Dominion the right to a colonial assembly. Now, at this point, that would not include local government. Moving on to what we would call the judicial branch, Andros had full power to design court systems. What would be a judicial district? Who would be the judge? How would juries be selected? And he had the full authority to appoint local sheriffs and other peacekeeping officers. He had complete control over law and order. One exception being that a court case could be appealed to a court in England if the value involved was greater than £300. Also, all laws that Andros did pass were to be sent to the king for final approval. Ultimately, it was Randolph who made most of these design decisions, and they aligned well with the priorities that King James II had set out for his empire, as he was rescinding city charters, and he will be recalling charters for not only the places we mentioned, but also Pennsylvania, Maryland, Carolina, Bahama, and Bermuda. Some of those charters will be successfully defended. And one of the goals to this renewing process, revetting process, redesigning process that you could almost call auditing was to take measure of all of the undeveloped land. Undeveloped meaning no one's farming on it, no one has a house on it, it's not part of a town square, it's not a roadway. They would say undeveloped, we would just call it nature. Because James II, for whom in this new system all the land would revert to that was undeveloped, needed this resource, like we talked about before, a tangible asset outside of the realm of Parliament. These are lands he can compensate his supporters with. And as Andros himself will say to folks in the upcoming years, any land an Englishman sets their feet upon is the king's land. But as it was, Sir Edmund Andros would not be the first executive officer over the Dun. As Edward Randolph had designed it, there would be a transitory temporary government, something to ease the transition from something verging on a theocracy to something resembling a dictatorship. Randolph designed this temporary government to have a president at the top, and below him a council. Those councilors would come from different areas in the Dominion and different sections of society, both in terms of religious denominations and economic status. The Lords of Trade even empowered Randolph to select who all of these men would be. And to be the first president, and only president, of the Dominion of New England was a man by the name of Joseph Dudley, who was actually in England because he was one of the agents that Massachusetts had sent over to negotiate with the Lords of Trade and hopefully preserve some elements of their current government. Instead, Joseph Dudley, who I have called a quisling before, but perhaps he was merely overawed by authority, Dudley doesn't fight for the wants and needs of the Massachusetts General Court. He begins cooperating with the Lords of Trade and with Randolph to plan this replacement government, and then Randolph puts him at the head of it. So the General Court, once again, sends him and a few other individuals without even the power of the General Court to accept a new charter, and what will happen instead is that he will return home and dissolve that General Court in favor of himself and his own council. You know, I talked myself back into it. He is a quisling. Either way, Dudley arrives in May of 1686. A man whose father was one of the founders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a former governor. Dudley was considered a moderate member of the Puritan fold, but he dissolves the General Court and names his 18 appointed counselors, which included many steadfast Puritans like Waite Winthrop, but also Robert Mason of New Hampshire, of course of the Mason family, and Robert Champernoun, a relative of the Gorges family, who happened to actually reject his position on the basis that the Dominion, lacking an assembly, ran contrary to the Magna Carta, a recurring theme. Once this was accomplished, Dudley also came over, having been authorized, if able, to absorb the Rhode Island and Connecticut colonies. So now the Dominion of New England could grow as large as Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and again the separate Narragansett country. But Dudley was a smart man, and he didn't go right for Rhode Island and Connecticut. Another thing that he did is that he withheld from the people of Massachusetts the fact that the Dominion would have liberty of conscience, something the Puritan elite would not be a fan of. And even though Edward Randolph estimated that only about 20% of the Massachusetts population, the male population anyway, had church membership, they were a very powerful 20%. And so Dudley withheld that. But otherwise, he could make acts and orders, everything understood to be temporary until Andros arrived. Dudley began a vice admiralty court, which would oversee cases involving ship seizures and cargo. Now, Edward Randolph, who also traveled back to Massachusetts, installed himself as one of Dudley's counselors, but also sought income as an informer. Because if you could tell authorities about a ship that had cargo, that had circumvented paying customs, if proven true, the informer received half the goods on the ship, the other half going to the crown, or more likely, to pay for the Dominion government. Now, when the Dominion would come online, in a sense, in full, it was supposed to generate revenue from a number of different land taxes. Dudley did none of these. For one thing, he owned a lot of land, and so did his friends. But Dudley did enforce the Navigation Acts, and in fact, suspended habeas corpus in pursuit of enforcing these acts most efficiently and making effective examples of those who decided not to pay their taxes. And to make all of this run even more efficiently, Dudley limited Massachusetts to 4 ports of entry: Boston, Salem, Ipswich, and Great Island. Now, even the changes instituted by this temporary government seem rather extreme, especially if you know anything about the Massachusetts Bay Colony before this point. But remember, there's a growing class of people in Massachusetts who were sick of Puritan rule, and in fact, they were the majority. And among other things, these people expected that eventually, as the temporary government gave way to something with more permanence, there would be a call for a legislative body. Many of the men in the colony who had been denied their right to suffrage under the Puritans assumed that eventually, in the near future, they would gain these rights under Andros. The historian Thomas Jefferson Wertenbacher sums up their hopes quite economically. He says, "No longer would they be refused the right to vote, no longer fined for not attending meetings, no longer subjected to laws not of their own making, no longer excluded from civil and military offices." Of course, we know that's not going to happen. While all of this is occurring, in June 1686, Sir Edmund Andros is officially made Governor of Massachusetts, the province of New Hampshire and Maine, and the Narragansett country. And in the same document, all of these areas were collectively renamed and referred to as the Dominion of New England. And on December 20th, 1686, Governor Andros arrives to the city of Boston, the place that will become the capital of the Dominion. And with him, he brought 60 redcoats, English regulars, and this would be the first time that regulars would be permanently stationed in New England. Now, during the takeover of New Netherland, the English did land a force in the New World to spearhead the invasion, but these men were always slated to return home as soon as possible. And if you lived in New England and you wanted to meet an English regular, you probably had to go to the New York colony. But these New Englanders, for the first time ever, have to deal with the fact that there is a standing army now in the city of Boston. These soldiers, of course, were not New Englanders. Most of them were likely not Puritans and would become seen as an occupying force. And I did bring up the fact that they were a standing army, which for us doesn't seem like that large of a deal. But in many places in the world, in the 17th century, if a nation isn't at war, the people become very suspicious when resources are being diverted to maintain a large standing army, that being an active army, not a militia who might muster one weekend a month or season, about for whom these soldiers are intended to oppose. And so again, while we might see a standing army as ordinary, New Englanders would tilt towards the view that they are being occupied, even if by their own mother country. Furthermore, these aren't just the rude fishermen, from the Puritan point of view, who work along the coastlines, or men off a cargo ship from a distant colony. These were men from outside of New England who suddenly had quite a deal of power within what was once the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they were only answerable to Edmund Andros himself. Despite these misgivings, when Andros arrived on December 20th, there was a large celebration welcoming him. And now having every power of government invested in himself, he instantly became the person all segments of society and individuals with ambitious intentions went to seek favor. On the surface, someone might come away with the initial reaction that Edmund Andros was quite popular. Edward Randolph, who designed both the Provisional Government and now the Permanent Dominion Government, was probably somewhat relieved by Andros's arrival. You see, under the temporary government, all these officials that he himself selected, he assumed he would still have some control over, some influence. And he found that the temporary government under Dudley quickly took on a nature of its own and moved past him completely. Now under Andros, he might be able to gain back some influence. And perhaps many of the fears of the Puritans were confirmed almost immediately when on Christmas of 1686, Andros, the other Anglicans, and the English regulars openly celebrated Christmas. We often think about the Puritans as being ultra-religious, of course they were, but some of the more festive aspects of holidays like Easter and Christmas were not observed by the Puritans, as they were considered heavily contaminated by pagan rituals. But Andros and his fellow Anglicans had themselves a Christmas somewhat akin to how Christmas was celebrated in New York. among the Dutch of the former New Netherland colony. Now, in decades past, observing these unbiblical traditions could have been cause for actual punishment, legal punishment, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And now the Puritans, quite suddenly, had no choice but to be tolerant of things that their parents and grandparents left England for in the first place. And you, the listener, don't have to agree with them. But again, you can't blame them for beginning to feel as if they were being invaded. Now, Dudley, as president of the Dominion, applied the new order quite lightly, and mostly within the borders of the Massachusetts colony, even though he was authorized to swallow up more than that. Andros was not quite as timid. There's an interesting paper you can find on JSTOR by Dror Goldberg and Eagle Mitchell-Tyak, and it's actually an economics paper about how Dudley was playing the long game, because he lived in Massachusetts, and he figured that this new order he was putting into place he could engineer to his own benefit, and he could do so slowly. Whereas Andros, knowing that colonial commissions to the posts of governors only lasted around 5 years, Andros wants to get the job done in the most efficient manner, and he knows that even if all goes well, he only has 5 years to accomplish what he's been tasked to do. So now Andros takes firm control of not only Massachusetts, but the Plymouth Colony, and New Hampshire and Maine, which often fell under the domain of Massachusetts. And then, of course, Narragansett country. An important thing to note here is that this effectively ended the Mayflower Compact, which the Plymouth Colony would elaborate on, but was still its founding document and still functioned as a partial constitution. Well, that was no more. Yes, it was the Dominion that kills the Mayflower Compact. And even before the year end of 1686, Andros went about touring the defensive capabilities of Boston Harbor and beyond. He discovered the armory at Castle Island only had about 1 barrel of powder, 50 old guns, and a couple of nearly inoperable cannon. Immediately suspicious, he put out a proclamation for the return of any public weaponry held in private hands. And taking the Castle Island fort in total, he saw no use in trying to fix it. Instead, he decided to break ground on a new fort, referred to different names at different times, but I'm just going to call it Fort Hill, which was close to the land and sea pathways in and out of Boston. He met with his counselors for the first time in December, all the way through January of 1687, where he set up expectations, and they planned to have quarterly meetings, but as we'll come to see, as many of the counselors lived quite far away, during many of these meetings, Andros won't have enough members of the council to form a quorum. But then again, he doesn't exactly need a quorum, because this isn't a democracy. The counselors are there to advise him. Andros ultimately makes the decisions, and then the counselors are to carry that back to their jurisdictions and make sure those instructions are followed. One of his first priorities was the development of a taxation system that would pay for his government, himself personally, with the goal of everything becoming self-sufficient as quickly as possible. Now, right away in January of 1687, Andros has his council begin evaluating the old laws of the former colonies. They very intelligently concluded that enforcing an old revenue law in Massachusetts that the people were used to before 1686 would be far easier than creating a new law. And there will be many new laws. It's the frog in the boiling pot. We're going to add just a little bit of heat to that pot just by enforcing the taxes that were already in place beforehand. The council was quite comfortable with this and began needling through old laws about taxation on cattle and former poll taxes on men 16 and older. And the council was also quite comfortable with a tax on imported or domestic spirits. Nothing completely out of line with what New Englanders would have seen before. But Andros had additional things in mind that the council wasn't so comfortable with. For one thing, as we mentioned, all public lands without improvements, but also including common areas, supposedly owned by municipalities, had their ownership all reverted back to the king. This caused the collapse of one of Dudley's schemes that he set up when he was president concerning a Dominion Bank, an official bank that would facilitate land speculation to his benefit and those of his associates. All of that falls apart. Again, Dudley's playing the long game. Andros is trying to get things done right now. And he's already ruffling the feathers of prominent New Englanders. This seems to be the extent of what Andros accomplished in council in January of 1687. Now, on the executive side of things, Sir Edmund Andros learned that there were ships coming directly from continental Europe using forged documents, claiming they came from Newfoundland and thus already passed through customs there in another English colony. Apparently, this was so pervasive, he declared that Newfoundland no longer had the status that other English colonies had within the Dominion, and any paperwork from Newfoundland carried no weight whatsoever. And beyond this, Andros doesn't turn up the heat again until March of 1687, after his council has the chance to meet again, where he tasks his counselors with developing a unified law code for the entire Dominion that would both apply universally, but also be in line with the laws of England. A staggering job to do. In another blow to Dudley and those within his orbit, he denounced the former United Colonies of New England, which you can hear our episodes on, but also the Atherton Company, which sought to eat up the land of the Narragansett. He places the Narragansett country within the Rhode Island colony subdivision of the Dominion of New England and outside of the control of these Puritan businessmen. And Andros said the following concerning the Atherton Company, that it was built on grants extorted through terror from the Indians by illegal acts of the United Colonies. During the same session, Andros creates a penny per pound tax on imports. His own council opposes the move, but Andros signs it into law without consultation. Now with the expanded Dominion, Andros declares the only ports of entry to be Boston, Salem, Portsmouth, Pemaquid, Bristol, and Newport. If this could be enforced, it would be all the easier to collect these new customs. He mandates that all teachers receive a license from him or his council in order to continue teaching. He also nullified all the local laws designed to support local teachers. Today we would call this a school tax. But one thing moving forward he neglects to do is to ever pass any sort of replacement for these nullified laws. And in effect, over the next 2 years, the educational system, as informal as it was in New England, began to break down. Teachers were afraid to teach without approval. Andros and council were slow to approve teachers, and the pathways to fund a schoolhouse were closed off. The Puritans would become very weary of this. Education was central to how they raised their children, both boys and girls. It was an important element in becoming formal church members. And the move was seen quite accurately as a way to further break down the Puritan system. And really, New Englanders feared this as the beginning of Anglican order in New England. King James II, the head of the Anglican Church, just happened to be a publicly professed Catholic. Many Puritans took the view that the Anglican Church was now just a secret unofficial arm of the Catholic Church and was in the process of being reabsorbed. This rumor and similar rumors had been floating around for a century now, and is in no small part one of the reasons why the Puritans and the Separatists relocated to the New World in the first place. They wanted out of the order, whether it be secretly Catholic or even Catholic light. Andros attacking how they educated their children raised a few eyebrows. Andros also set standards for the value of different methods of paying these new taxes. In New England, there had developed a customary discount for paying in actual coin money, which was a rare sight in the colonies. That discount went away. But then he also set an artificially low value for corn, well below the actual market value, when using that commodity to pay taxes. Andros in the near future would write back to England that even with the new taxes he set up in March of 1687, by his calculations, it wouldn't be enough to fund the new government and the 60 regulars in the colony. And with all these new taxes, the poll tax, the tax on cattle, spirits, imports, and in his mind there are going to be land taxes, Andros tells his counselors to travel the settlements within their districts, where the people were to elect commissioners. These commissioners were to essentially hold a census of their local population, and with that, an audit of all the real estate and portable wealth a person owned. Rather invasive for the time, and the Puritans were right to suspect that this information would be used for the collection of new taxes, the nature of which weren't even revealed to them yet. Finally, beyond all these new things, Andros declared that all previous laws would remain in effect until he could revise them. Again, a single law code being the goal, but in the intervening time, we're not having chaos. And with this session finished, Andros and his fellow Anglicans wished to celebrate Easter in their own fashion. Now, previously, when he arrived in December, he asked the Puritan community of Boston to lend the Anglicans one of their churches to be used for Anglican service when convenient for the Congregationalist Puritans who owned the church. He was denied his request. Now coming up on Easter of 1687, Andros demands the use of the Third Church at Boston for his Anglican services, which he proposed would be held after the Congregationalist services, and thus would cause no obstruction of its normal use. On Easter, Andros went to the church. Outside, the Puritans who worshipped in that church stood in protest and showed Andros their deed to the building. He ignored them, pushed past them, and entered the building and held an Anglican service. And from this point on, he did so every week. And he actually began plans to create his own Anglican church in Boston, the first Anglican church in New England. And in the wider picture, during this Easter season, people were holding maypole celebrations and pulling Shrove Tuesday pranks. These were traditions that the Puritans had filtered out of the general English culture when they came over to New England, and now here they were. In fact, almost 2 generations ago, a man named Thomas Morton had his own colony of Marymount, which you can hear about earlier in this season. He held a maypole celebration and was twice removed from New England through the efforts of both the separatists of the Plymouth Colony and the Puritan types who were filtering into what would become the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and finally the Bay Colony itself. Removing Thomas Morton was the beginning of the cooperation between these dissident colonies. It brought them together against a common enemy, and they won. Now, here we are decades later, and because the Dominion of New England now has freedom of conscience, maypole festivals are held openly. Now, during these, a large pole, of course, would be constructed, placed in the ground, with many ropes covered in ribbons and other little decorative bits of cloth descending outwards from the top of the pole. People would dance and sing around the pole, and it served as a spring renewal, fertility type of ritual. And the social mores concerning being fruitful and multiplying were relaxed during this time. For the Puritans, much like how there weren't ceremonies venerating a St. Nicholas in the Bible, nowhere did it say to hold these maypole ceremonies. And as these visible symbols of a fallen state began to weigh more and more heavily on the Puritan elite, it really did seem to them that God was punishing his elect for their transgressions. It's hard for us to understand this today, because even if you're religious, you tend not to be fundamentalist. A fundamentalist believing and thinking and feeling that the world around them is infused with their religious beliefs. Where many of us, even if we're religious, we're still fairly secular. I have the things I believe in my morality, but in my everyday interactions with the world, I tend to find a materialistic answer for why things are the way they are. The Puritans, not so much. God is not a micromanager, but he is the clockmaker, and things that happen in the world happen on his time, for his reasons, on his schedule. And what happens next will hit the Puritan churches square in their pocketbooks. On April 4th, 1687, King James II issued his Declaration of Indulgence, which allowed liberty of conscience in public worship across the entirety of the English realm. By June of 1687, Andros would use this to strip the Puritan congregational churches of their right to collect local taxes and fines to fund themselves. Remember, by Randolph's estimation, only about 20% of Massachusetts, anyway, had a population of actual church members, but 100% of the colony, in one way or the other, would have to fund that local church. No more. Randolph, in one of his letters, went so far as to even suggest that these newly licensed teachers should be confirmed by an Anglican authority in England. Now, if you were the conspiratorial type in New England, it really did seem like you were living through an Anglican takeover. Even though the Lords of Trade never intended for there to be a collection of a tithe for the Anglican Church, you and your New England community in 1687, you couldn't have known that. There had already been a number of surprises just in the 3 or 4 months that Andros had been in the colony. Backtracking a little bit into May, Andros begins in earnest to build a chain of forts from the fort right outside of Boston all the way up the coast of Maine. And he must have felt quite comfortable in his position at this point, because each one of these forts would receive a small number of those English regulars he brought with him, and supplemented by local militias. These forts would be way stations for moving English forces, protection from pirates, a place to run to if the natives turn hostile, and of course part of a larger scheme to defend against and eventually go on the offensive against the French in their colony to the north and west. And in an even bolder move on the part of Andros, he unveiled his plan for confirming deeds, and he required all landowners within the Dominion to come to him to have their lands confirmed or reconfirmed by himself. Now, this would come at a cost, fees set by Andros, sometimes very high, and people or representatives of those people would have to travel to Boston to undergo this process. Not an easy feat for some people in an era of travel by leg, hoof, and sail. Now, as mentioned before in this extremely long podcast, there were those who pined for this new confirmation of their lands. People who had land disputes with other settlers, those who had bought land directly from the Native Americans and now feared those purchases becoming invalidated, and then of course Andros's own counselors petitioned him for grants of land in the most fruitful undeveloped portions of New England. But in the larger scheme, this was a necessary move to instituting the order that Andros was supposed to put into place and collect the appropriate amount of revenue to run such a government. But by requiring everyone to confirm deeds with Andros, it in effect invalidated the entire title history of New England. And many on the ground suspected this was a move to dispossess the freeholders and institute a feudal order. They wouldn't be too far off. Now, originally, Andros was to extract a quit rent from grants that he would issue to these undeveloped lands. A quit rent, I have defined many times over the course of this season. Originally, it was a sum of money or goods that could be paid to a feudal lord to exempt a subject from their yearly service on the lord's private estate. But the further in time we move, a quit rent resembles what we would call today a property tax, because it will be levied on land that you own, and proportional to how much land you own. Now, what Andros did not reveal at the time is that he planned on instituting a quit rent on all the new grants, not just for undeveloped land. You could go to him to get your lands confirmed that your family purchased from the Pokanoket people in the 1620s or 30s, and you've maintained ever since, and have the security of the new deed under the new colonial order, and at a certain undisclosed point, Andros would start demanding this quit rent, which he proposed secretly would be 2 shillings and 6 pence on every 100 acres. And lastly on this subject, Andros put a hold on any new purchases from Native Americans. In other words, an English colonist could not buy land from them directly, as they had in the past, and he even undid a few real estate transactions that occurred before his arrival. Moving on, in June of 1687, Andros formally absorbs Rhode Island, which had already willingly deferred to Dominion authority. He returns to find grumblings about his new taxes. Centered around the town of Ipswich, within Essex County, Massachusetts, the local officials were refusing to hold the aforementioned census and auditing of the men in the town. And rather than having a violent rebellion, many of the influential people in Ipswich and the surrounding Essex County simply practiced civil disobedience and refused to facilitate the collection of these taxes. Some even citing, again, the Magna Carta, as outside of the old Massachusetts taxes now being reinstated, the new taxes were derived from Andros himself in no legislative body, affording representation to the people for whom they are taxing. Andros would have all of these men arrested, no matter their status or positions they held, and imprisoned without right of habeas corpus. The Congregationalist ministers of Boston then called for a day of thanksgiving to secure, in quotes, hopes of deliverance from an approaching persecution. Andros summoned these ministers and forbid such a thanksgiving, and none would be publicly held. In what, in a lesser man's hands, could have quickly grown into a coup from the landowning and religious classes of Massachusetts, Andros reduced that fire down to embers. But those embers will linger, so don't lose track of them. And Andros figured he would take these prisoners and let them sit for a while. And feeling quite secure once again, in October of 1687, he actually moved to Annexing Connecticut, a colony that 3 times before refused the Dominion's request for submission. Andros had in hand permission to rescind their charter. He presents himself at their general court, and as the story goes, the lights were extinguished in the room, and when they were relit, the Connecticut charter went missing, famously and perhaps mythically stowed away in an oak tree. Now, if you turn over a Connecticut quarter from the State Quarter series in the early 2000s, you'll see a large oak tree. That's why it's there. The Connecticut General Court can say they never surrendered their charter. Nevertheless, Andros did dissolve that court and take over Connecticut. 11 or so years after his first attempt to absorb Connecticut into New York, he has won the day. Now returning to Boston, throughout fall of 1687, Andros decided to slowly process these tax protesters in his custody. At first, he and his council sifted what amounted to 28 men into 3 groups of prisoners. The first group being a low-level offender, a tax protester who neither held public office nor influenced anyone else to protest a tax. The second group, a little more influential, was released on a 200-pound bail each. But the third group, men of local and even colony-wide influence, they would be put on trial as an example. This last group would be 6 of the 28 men, including a member of the prominent Bradford family. One of the judges was former President Dudley, now a counselor. The men argued their rights that were derived from the Magna Carta. Dudley argued that those rights do not follow you to the end of the earth. They may apply in England, but we're not in England. And the juries created by Andros and his counselors were disproportionately Anglican and newcomers to the colonies from the old country. They were all found guilty, charged massive fines, and those offices that they held on the local level were stripped of them and reassigned in special elections while they were imprisoned. They returned home completely defeated, and as consequence of their actions, Andros, who had previously left local government mostly untouched, limited town meetings to only once a year, claiming that the Dominion super-colonial government had taken on enough responsibilities formerly delegated to local environs that they only now required a once-a-year meeting. It is really towards the end of 1687 that the tares begin to develop within the Dominion. Remember, the Massachusetts Mint had been shut down in 1684. Coin money was becoming scarce in the colony. Land sales would grind to a halt because of the new and confusing and restrictive requirements, and even Edward Randolph, in a letter dated to November 1687, admitted that the enforcement of the Navigation Acts were hurting the economy. From the land to the sea, the Dominion had installed so many metaphorical toll booths along the way, the economy took a dive, and even that new class of non-Puritan wealthy merchants living along the seaboard found themselves suddenly sliding into bankruptcy under this new Dominion, which did not deliver suffrage to them as they expected. And the historian Richard R. Johnson, in his book Adjustment to Empire, calculates that Andros's taxes for the new year, 1688, would be on average 2.5 times greater than his 1687 taxes. But early 1688 will be quite fortuitous for Edmund Andros. The French were supplying guns and ammunition to the Abenaki in the far north of the Dominion and encouraging them to attack the English, which they did. Andros led a short and successful campaign there early in the year. Meanwhile, in the New York colony, which was not part of the Dominion of New England, the French spent the previous year attacking the Five Nations, the Iroquois, and specifically the Seneca, the westernmost member of their confederacy, to such a damaging effect that King James II ordered the governor of New York to annex the Iroquois as English subjects for their own protection. Read into that as you wish. But the governor knew he didn't have the population or resources to protect both New York and the Iroquois from the French and their allies. And he suggests back to the king that New York be annexed by the Dominion of New England. King James II naturally liked that idea. New York was his proprietary colony, and if he could, in a way, socialize the costs of defending it by becoming a division of the Dominion, all the better. And by April 7th, 1688, Andros received a commission enabling him to absorb New York, and with it, the colonies of East and West Jersey. And to make this even easier, the proprietary owners of both East and West Jersey surrendered their right to government back to King James II, finding the responsibility and wealth required to run a government a complete nuisance, but in return receiving from King James II title to their lands, including the undeveloped lands, and in what seems to be a contradiction, protected those assets from seizure by Edmund Andros, an ancient foe of the New Jersey colonies. Now, before traveling to New York and the Jerseys, in July of 1688, because so many landowners had embraced the tactic of simply ignoring the call to renew land titles, Andros hits 5 of the largest landowners in New England with a writ of intrusion that would compel them to explain to Andros how they came upon their land, what was their title history, and then pay for a new title. They, like the tax protesters before them, were to be set apart as examples and a sign of what was to come if you resisted the new order. And then Andros, by the end of the summer, traveled to and officially annexed New York, East New Jersey, and West New Jersey, the three colonies taking their submission in an amicable manner. And with this move, Andros ended the plan of a tentative second super colony for the middle colonies that had been discussed in 1682 and 83. His military command would now also extend from the top of Maine all the way down to the Delaware River. In Albany, New York, he holds a conference with the Iroquois, who remember him well from the time when he was governor of New York, and first created the Silver Covenant chain with them. He went south of Albany and renewed his relationship with a group that historical documents often call the River Indians. This would be the Algonquian people who lived in what is now the Hudson River Valley and Riverway of New York. As Governor Dongan of New York was outgoing, the new incoming governor, Francis Nicholson, was elevated by Andros to become the Lieutenant Governor General of the Dominion, and he would effectively have power over New York and the Jerseys. Meanwhile, the local governments in these three colonies were mostly left alone, and old officials sworn in under the new regime. Just to go back to our earlier episodes on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, those were absorbed by New York earlier, and now since New York is part of the Dominion, so would those former island colonies fall within Andros's grasp. Andros now commanded a council that had 7 members from Massachusetts, 1 from New Hampshire, 2 from Maine, 6 from Plymouth, 1 from Narragansett Country, 7 from Rhode Island, 2 from Connecticut, 8 from New York, none from the Jersey colonies, and 3 from England. And taking the Dominion in as a whole, Andros has enveloped every single area we have learned about in this season of the podcast. And now he's even knocking on the door of the Pennsylvania and Maryland colonies. Their respective proprietors will try to hold him off. Andros in this year completes the King's Chapel in Boston, the first Anglican church in New England. He now controls the area that will someday become 6 of the 13 original colonies. And he had done all this in well under 2 years of arriving in Boston. At this point, he sends away for his wife, finding the Dominion impressive enough to earn the grace of her presence. But now we have reached the end of our episode. This was the story of the rise of the Dominion of New England, and Andros didn't know it yet. But in this moment, he was living through the apex of his powers. And this is where I will leave you. I'm Eric Yanis. This has been the Other States of America History Podcast. Thank you for listening.